The two coffees were still warm when I set them on the hood of someone else's car. I wasn't thinking about the car. I was standing in the Harbor Cross parking lot on a Saturday morning in November, completely still, listening to my 8-year-old son say something on the other side of a blue sedan that I was not supposed to hear. The words came in pieces through the cold air. A name, then another name, then one specific word that made the coffee I was holding go cold in my hand before I had taken a single sip. My name is Callum Vreeland. I am a structural engineer by profession, which means I spend most of my working days calculating exactly how much weight a thing can carry before it gives. I look at what cannot be seen from the surface. I identify the point where something will break before it has broken. I believe for a long time that this made me perceptive, that I paid close attention to the people I loved. I had 3 weeks to be wrong about that before that Saturday morning, and I have not stopped thinking about those 3 weeks since. Noah was 8 years old and had been swimming competitively since he was 6. He loved the water in a way that was almost physical to watch. Not performing it, not grinding through it, he would walk out onto the deck at Harbor Cross, and you could see something in him settle, like the part of him that was always slightly restless on land had finally found its correct environment. We drove to practice 4 mornings a week. He fell asleep in the back seat on the way there and was awake before I turned into the lot, every single time, like his body knew. I kept a playlist he had made himself on the drives home. 4 songs, always the same 4, and we sang all of them badly with the windows cracked even in October because he liked the cold air when the music was on. We stopped at the same gas station every Tuesday for chocolate milk, the kind in the small glass bottle that cost too much, and that he held with both hands and finished before we pulled back onto the road. Those drives were some of the best 30 minutes of my week. The ribbons from his meets were pinned to a corkboard above his desk. Blue, red, yellow. He was not particularly proud of the ribbons themselves. He kept them because his grandmother had asked him to, but what he cared about was the water, the specific pressure of it, the way it held him and resisted him at the same time. That distinction between loving the prize and loving the thing always made me proud of him. I did not notice when he stopped wearing his team jacket. It was a navy blue jacket with the Harbor Cross crest stitched on the chest, and for nearly 2 years he had worn it constantly. To school, to his grandmother's house on Sundays, to the grocery store where he would unzip it halfway because the store was warm, and he refused to take it off entirely. Then at some point in late October, it stopped appearing on his body and started appearing on the back of his desk chair. Every morning I walked past that chair and saw it there. I noticed it the way you notice something that belongs where it is. I did not ask him about it. I assumed weather. I assumed preference. I assumed that 8-year-olds change their minds about things without telling you, and that this was one of those things. I told myself it meant nothing. I have replayed that jacket every single day. On the Saturday morning in November, I had parked the car and walked ahead to the building's entrance to get coffee from the machine in the lobby while Noah went to the locker room. I was walking back through the lot when I heard his voice from somewhere to my left. He was standing between 2 parked cars about 20 feet away, talking to a boy I recognized from the older age group, a 12-year-old named Eli, who had been at the club for years. I was going to wave. I was going to call out and tell Noah practice started in 10 minutes. Then I heard what he was saying. I will not write the exact words here. What I will tell you is that Noah was describing something that had happened in Coach Marsh's office. He was using the careful, flat language children sometimes use when they are explaining something they do not have the proper vocabulary for yet. He said the coach's name 3 times. He said the word office twice. And then he said something that no sentence spoken by an 8-year-old should contain. Eli was standing with his head down and his hands in his pockets, nodding slowly in the way someone nods when the specific details are new to them, but the general shape of what is being described is not. I set the coffees on the nearest hood, and I did not move. Noah looked up and saw me standing there. What happened to his face, I am not going to describe. I will only say that it was the most important thing I have ever seen, and I understood every word of it without a single word being spoken aloud. We drove home without talking. Noah sat in the back seat. The playlist was loaded on the screen, and I did not start it. He did not ask me to. Halfway home, he said, "Dad, I don't know how much you heard." I told him I heard enough. He nodded and looked out at the road going past and said nothing else until I parked in the driveway. Then, before he opened the door, he said, "I didn't want to mess everything up." That was all. He got out of the car and went inside, and I sat there for a few minutes with the engine off before I followed him. That evening, after Noah was in bed, I told Diane. She sat at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug of tea she never drank. I watched the steam stop rising from it while I spoke. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Not the quiet of someone gathering words, but the quiet of someone who has just been handed something too heavy to hold without first deciding where to put it. Then she said 2 words. "How long?" Not a question, just the weight of it. I did not know how to answer. That was the first thing that cracked something open in me. I had been driving my son to that building 4 mornings a week, and I did not know how long. I did not know. The following morning, we took Noah to the emergency pediatric unit at St. Brendan's. We told him we needed a doctor to take a look and ask him some questions and that he was not in any trouble. He nodded and looked at his shoes. Diane held his hand the entire time in the waiting room. I sat beside them and stared at a health poster on the wall, a bright blue poster about hand washing, and I read it 7 times without retaining a single word from it. The nurse who first assessed Noah was a woman named Renata. She was quiet and measured and spoke directly to him without softening her language into something patronizing. At one point during the intake, she wrote something on the form, then drew a single, clean, horizontal line through it and wrote something else. I watched her do it. She caught my eye when she looked up. She held my gaze for exactly 1 second before returning to the form. I did not ask her what she had crossed out. I should have asked her. That single line on a form lived in my thinking for 2 weeks before I understood what it meant. And by then, it had already changed how I read everything else. A detective was assigned by Monday afternoon. Her name was Detective Carla Oben. She was precise and professional in the way she communicated, not distant but sealed, like every word she used had been selected to transmit information and nothing beyond information. She took Noah's recorded statement in a pale yellow room with 2 low chairs and a box of crayons on a small table beside the window. She walked Diane and me through the procedural steps in clear, sequential order. She answered every question I asked with accurate information. She did not dismiss anything I said, and at no point in the 2 hours we sat with her did she communicate anything that resembled the expectation that this case would result in charges. Not through doubt, not through dismissal, through the professional steadiness of someone who has seen cases like this before and knows precisely how most of them end. I have worked alongside building inspectors who speak to contractors in exactly that register when the contractor already understands the building is not going to pass, and the inspector is simply completing a required process. That night I sat at the dining room table after Diane went to bed, and I opened my laptop. I had built my strategy on an assumption since Sunday morning. The assumption was that whatever had happened to Noah was recent, weeks old, not months. That Marsh had acted alone, that this was isolated. I had no evidence for any of it. I had constructed it because the alternative was a scale I did not want to look at directly yet. I told Diane it was manageable, that we were likely dealing with something contained. I was wrong about that in a way that would cost me time and direction, and eventually something harder to name. Gerald Marsh had been head coach at Harbor Cross Swim Club for 11 years. He had developed 17 regional champions. He ran a named scholarship through the city's recreation authority for swimmers from low-income families. His photograph hung on the wall of the Recreation Authority's main office, positioned between a retired city councilor and a former national qualifier. The local newspaper's digital archive held 16 articles about him across 8 years, every one of them a version of the same story. Dedicated coach, transformative mentor, a man who built character alongside athletic skill. Then, buried in a web archive from 3 years back, I found a post on a regional parents forum that had been deleted from the live site. The post was short. It asked why Harbor Cross's assistant coach had resigned without any public announcement or explanation, and whether anyone had information. There were 14 responses before the thread was taken down. Most of them speculated or dismissed the question. But one response from an account that had since been deactivated said, "Some things get handled quietly so they don't become anything larger." 14 responses. Thread removed. Assistant coach resigned without explanation. I closed my laptop and looked at the assumption I had spent 7 days building strategy on. I set it aside. I did not sleep that night. The step I took next was not legal. I want to say that plainly because it mattered later in ways that were costly. I opened an email account under a name that suggested Regional Health and Safety Administration. I called the Harbor Cross Administrative Office the next morning and told the woman who answered that I was a compliance officer conducting routine documentation audits across youth sports facilities in the region. I told her I needed incident report logs covering the past 4 years sent to my office by end of business. She said she would need to check with management before releasing anything. I told her that routine compliance documentation was not subject to internal management authorization under the Regional Recreation Health Code. I invented the code. She said she would send the files over. 47 pages arrived at 4:43 in the afternoon. I drove to a FedEx store and printed all of them 11 minutes later, standing under fluorescent lights with the machine running warm against my arm. The pages smelled like fresh ink. I read them at the counter before I had put a single page in a folder. There were 4 incident reports across those 4 years that had been amended after their original filing dates. Each amendment had removed a specific individual's name from the narrative section and replaced it with the phrase, "Senior Coaching Staff Member." The original version of each report had named Gerald Marsh by name. All 4 amendments had been authorized by the same club administrator, a man named Conrad Wells. Conrad Wells had received a donation to a personal charity of his choosing every year for 4 consecutive years from the Gerald Marsh Community Swimming Foundation. The foundation was a registered nonprofit. The donation amounts were public. They averaged $9,000 annually. I stood at that counter for a long time. This was not a recent problem. It was not isolated. And I had spent 7 days building my response on the assumption that it was both of those things. I found Stuart Feld through a contact in the regional swim community who remembered him vaguely from the Harbor Cross program 3 years back. He had moved to a city 400 kilometers away. He worked at a municipal recreation center. He answered the phone on the second ring. His first words were not a greeting. His first words were, "I have been waiting for someone to call." Stuart was 34. He had been assistant coach at Harbor Cross for 3 years before his resignation. He told me in a voice that contained no surprise whatsoever that he had filed an internal complaint about Marsh's conduct involving 2 specific children in the program. Conrad Wells investigated it and found it without merit. Stuart then filed with the Regional Recreation Authority. That complaint was routed back to Wells for a response. 6 weeks after that, a lawyer Stuart had never spoken to, representing the Harbor Cross Board of Directors, called to offer him a financial settlement and a non-disclosure agreement. Stuart had 2 young children. His wife was 4 months into a medical leave that showed no clear endpoint. He signed the agreement. He told me all of it evenly. No bitterness in his voice, no performance of guilt, no request for absolution. Just facts, delivered by someone who had rehearsed telling them in private for 3 years and was finally saying them out loud to a person who had a use for them. He could not give me the agreement itself, still bound by it. But he told me which families had raised informal concerns that never became formal reports. He told me which incident report in the stack had been amended first, and what the original language said before Wells edited it out. And then, near the end of the call, he said something that I wrote down in the margin of the printed pages and did not fully understand. He said, he did not pick the ones who might make noise. He picked the ones for whom the sport was the biggest thing in their life. Because those kids will carry anything quietly rather than risk losing the water. They love it too much to burn it down. I wrote it down. I thought I understood it. I understood it partially, the way you understand a blueprint when you are only looking at one floor. He told me one more thing before the call ended, in the same even tone. He said the child he had filed the original complaint about had never returned to competitive swimming. The child was 11 years old when Stewart filed. He was, Stewart said, the most naturally gifted young swimmer he had ever coached. There was nothing to say to that. I did not try. I reached out to the two families Stewart named. One father, a man named Gregory, answered within the hour. His daughter had aged out of the program 2 years earlier. In the months after she left Harbor Cross, she had stopped wanting to talk about swimming entirely. He had understood this as a teenager putting distance between herself and a younger chapter of her life. He had not read it as anything darker, because nothing around him had suggested a darker reading. He had trusted the environment. He was willing to give a formal statement. The second family did not respond to my first contact or my second. Diane told me not to call Marsh. She said it clearly, without volume, the morning after my call with Stewart. She said, "You have the documents, you have Stewart, you have Gregory. You do not need to be in a room with that man." She was correct. She was completely and unambiguously correct. I called him anyway. I constructed a reason. I told myself it was tactical, that I might learn something about how he was positioned, that a conversation might reveal where the gaps in his cover story were. He had heard through someone in the swim community that I was asking questions. He reached out through a mutual acquaintance to suggest a meeting, framed as clearing the air between two people who clearly had a misunderstanding. I agreed to it. He met me at a coffee shop he chose. He was composed in the specific way of someone who had rehearsed being composed. He expressed genuine-sounding concern for Noah. He said children in high-performance environments sometimes develop complicated emotional responses to mentorship. He said competitive pressure occasionally caused children to misattribute the source of their anxiety. He said none of this while looking directly at me. He said all of it while looking at a point slightly past my left shoulder. I drove home and told Diane what had happened. She looked at me for a moment and walked out of the room without a word. 3 weeks later, my lawyer told me the defense was going to use that meeting as a narrative cornerstone. They would argue I had approached Marsh privately as a first attempt to negotiate something before going public when the private approach failed. He was not angry when he told me this. He simply walked me through it the way a structural engineer walks a client through a load-bearing failure. Precisely, without softening. I had handed them a line of attack they would not have had if I had listened to my wife. I sat with that. The Harbor Cross Swim Club held its annual fundraising gala on the first Friday of December. The gala was the social centerpiece of the club's year, attended by donors, city officials, Recreation Authority board members, coaches, and parents. The Recreation Authority presented its Community Builder of the Year award at the gala. That year's recipient was Gerald Marsh. The gala was a public event. Diane and I attended. Gregory and his wife attended. We did not coordinate seating. We did not arrive together. We were simply present. The award was presented after dinner, after the speeches from the Recreation Authority chairman, after the video reel of program highlights set to soft background music. Marsh stood at the front of the room in a dark suit and accepted a small glass trophy from the chairman with the relaxed ease of a man who had been standing in exactly this kind of light his entire life. He thanked the recreation authority. He thanked the club. He thanked the community. He said the children of Harbor Cross were his life's work. I stood up from my table. I did not go to the front of the room. I did not request a microphone. I stood where I was, and I spoke loudly enough to reach every corner of the room without raising my voice unnecessarily. I said my name. I said my son's name. I said the name of the swim club and the name of Gerald Marsh. And I told the room that I had in my possession 4 incident reports from the club's own records, their original versions and their amended versions, showing that Marsh's name had been systematically removed from each one after they were filed. I said I had documentation of annual financial transfers between Marsh's personal foundation and the administrator who performed those amendments. I said I had a sworn statement from a former assistant coach who had filed an internal complaint 3 years ago and been offered a financial settlement to remain silent. I did not accuse. I read. I read 2 sentences from an original incident report. Then I read the corresponding sentences from the amended version. I read them in sequence, and I let the room hear the difference between what had been written and what had been replaced. Marsh was still holding the glass trophy. His expression through the first 30 seconds of my speaking was one of practiced patience, the expression of a man allowing a disturbance to run its course before the appropriate people removed it. Then I read the second set of documents. His expression did not collapse. It did not become rage or panic. It simply stopped. Like a performance that had been running for 11 years had just lost power mid-scene. He told the room I was a disturbed individual conducting a vendetta. His voice stayed steady. He gestured to the event staff. He called for someone to handle the situation. 2 parents I barely knew stood up before anyone reached my table. Gregory stood. His wife stood. The room divided in the way rooms divide when a thing has been said that the air itself cannot unsay. We were asked to leave. We left. A journalist who attended the gala every year for the lifestyle section of the regional paper published her account the following morning. She reproduced photographs of the documents I had placed on the table. By noon, the article had been shared 900 times. Detective Oben called at 7:48 in the morning. Her voice was exactly as it had always been. She said 3 things without preamble. The department was formally reopening the investigation. A second family had filed a complaint overnight, and Stuart Feld's non-disclosure agreement was applicable only to civil proceedings and carried no force in a criminal investigation. That third sentence was delivered in the same flat professional register as the first 2. I sat down on the kitchen floor. I stayed there for a while. The investigation ran for 6 weeks. It found what the amended reports had been built to conceal. Gerald Marsh had been the subject of formal internal complaints from 4 separate families over 8 years. Each complaint had been routed exclusively through Conrad Wells. Each one had been resolved without escalation. Marsh's personal laptop contained documentation organized by name, by date, by session, the kind of organized documentation that a man produces when he intends to keep something permanent and private for a long time. Conrad Wells was arrested 6 days after Marsh. His charge, obstruction, and the systematic falsification of official records. The Recreation Authority severed its relationship with the club within the week. New regional safeguarding legislation for youth sports programs was drafted before the trial began. The trial ran for 3 months. The defense characterized my gala intervention as a public smear campaign driven by a parent who had failed to get satisfaction through private negotiation. They questioned the legality of the incident report request I had made under a false identity. They used my private meeting with Marsh as evidence of an attempted personal settlement that had broken down. My lawyer had warned me about every one of those 3 lines of attack before the trial began. The third one landed differently than the other 2, not because it was the strongest argument, but because it was built on something I had actually done. The jury was out for 4 days. Marsh was convicted on 9 of 11 counts. The sentence was 19 years. Conrad Wells entered a guilty plea separately on 2 counts of obstruction. The Recreation Authority announced a full structural review of safeguarding protocols across all youth programs in the region. Mandatory reporting requirements and independent oversight boards became law within the year. Noah stopped swimming after the conviction. He did not announce it. Practice simply stopped being a part of the weekly conversation, and I did not force it back in. He went to school and came home and spent his evenings in his room with the old wooden construction set he had owned since he was 4, the one with the notched planks and the small brass connectors that his grandfather had given him. I would sit in the kitchen at the end of the day and listen to the quiet sound of pieces fitting together in the room next to mine. That sound, those quiet evenings, were some of the hardest 30 minutes of my week. Diane and I discussed other programs, other coaches, a different city swim association. We decided nothing. We let him lead. In late spring, on a Saturday morning, Noah came downstairs with his swim goggles around his neck and asked if we could go to the lake. There was a freshwater lake about 20 minutes from the house, a lake we had taken him to twice when he was younger and not yet serious about the sport. He had his bag already packed. We drove out without much conversation. He went in without hesitating and swam out toward a marker buoy 300 meters from shore with the same form he had always had, the same economy of movement that had made his coaches stop and watch him when he was 6 years old. I stood at the water's edge while he swam. He came back. He stood in the shallows with the water at his waist. He looked at his hands just below the surface for a moment. Then he said, "It still feels the same." I did not say anything. We stood at the edge of the water while the morning moved around us. It was at the trial, during the prosecution's examination of the digital evidence recovered from Marsh's phone, that the prosecutor had read aloud a text message sent from Marsh to Conrad Wells. The message had been sent 2 years before Noah ever came to Harbor Cross. It said, "New kid is exceptional, completely committed. That kind doesn't talk. The water is the whole world to them." He had identified Noah before Noah could identify what was being done to him. He had chosen him because of the precise quality I had always loved most in my son. The way the water was not a sport to Noah, but a location, the truest place he knew, the place where the restless part of him finally went quiet. Marsh had read that quality before Noah could read what was being done with it, and he had used it as the architecture of Noah's silence. Because a child who understands, on whatever level a child understands these things, that speaking means losing the water, will carry almost anything before they speak. That is what Stewart had meant on the phone. That is the thing I wrote in the margin and thought I understood and did not fully understand. I understood the mechanism. I did not understand that my son had been walking around for months with the knowledge, unspoken and possibly unformed, but present, that telling the truth was going to cost him the most important thing in his life. He had not been silent out of fear alone. He had been silent out of love. Standing at the lake that spring morning, watching Noah come back through the shallows, I thought about that message. I thought about what he had carried and why, and how much of it he had carried without knowing he was carrying it. I thought about every Tuesday drive, the same 4 songs, the small glass bottle held in both hands, the way he looked at the water on the way into practice, before any of this, before the jacket stopped appearing on his body, before the parking lot, before I understood what kind of structure I had actually been living inside, and how long its weight had been distributed across my son. He walked out of the water and shook the wet from his hair and stood on the bank beside me. Then he turned and looked back at the lake once, not with fear, not with grief, just the way a child looks at something that still belongs to him. That was enough.